Neeraj, the funny thing is that we first met, when was it, April or March 2000? So over 4 years
Yeah.
ago now. It's insane.
Mhm.
And that was the first week of the very first lockdown in Japan for
Yes.
for COVID.
I know. So it's already been almost 4 years.
Yeah, isn't that insane?
That's crazy.
Yeah, yeah, I can't believe it. Like
Yeah.
and like speaking of Zoom and stuff, remember that before COVID, like I mean, people were doing conference calls and stuff, and like,
Right.
but the whole scene changed so much in
Yeah.
that first year of COVID, right?
I know. That's crazy.
So
So
man,
you've
I've
you've been doing a podcast now?
oh yeah, I started it in 2000, I think
Mm.
2000, and I did about 70 episodes like in the
Oh,
first
wow.
9 months or so. And then I slowed down drastically. So I have only done 10 or so in the last year.
Mm.
And it's been very interesting because for me it was about um like two things. First of all, like when I'm touring, then I have actually sort of exposure to real people, meeting
Hmm.
after gigs and sort of like building relationships and stuff. And
Right.
when the lockdown time started, that was really missing. And at the same time, I also wanted to reconnect with people that I hadn't talked to in a long
Talked to
time.
in a while. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I then started making a list of people I wanted to talk to, and people I thought that were interesting, old friends, new friends, and
Yeah, yeah.
started doing it. And it was a very therapeutic experience.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. And so right now, like my aim is to do 100 podcasts of this kind of conversation, that
Hmm.
conversation that's totally open and free, and just sort of like it goes wherever it needs to go, and sort of like sometimes even maybe finding some wisdom. Uh,
Right, right.
you know.
Yeah. No, that's cool. That's so nice.
Like before we found your studio, um, we were somebody gave us an address for a studio, and we went there, and it was sort of like a rehearsal studio with
Okay.
sort of like electric pianos in small rooms, and
I
that
didn't
was
know that.
you didn't know that? Yeah, that was the day
No.
before we came to your place. That was on the Monday. And so
Oh,
and and at that point we were really thinking, oh, maybe it's not going to happen what we want to do here. But then
yeah.
coming into your place, it was like the day and night, or night and day actually,
Yeah.
getting getting to your place. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, so um I mean, obviously I know a little bit about you, and I looked up your things you've done on Discogs and stuff. But what would be like most interesting to me is sort of like like really how you ended up doing what you do, and how you came to Japan, especially like learning a third language. I
hmm.
guess, right?
Hmm.
It's I like this, you like to understand like what kind of flow you got into, and also at what age, like what um, I consider you to be a great music lover. That's sort of like the vibe you have, as sort of
Hmm.
like a totally resting within the world of sound. And
Hmm.
I think both artistically but also technically, right?
Hmm.
Like as an engineer. And so tell me a little bit about your path.
So, well, so the thing is, I grew up in Japan. My family was living in Japan, for the past 50 years. And so for the first 15 years of my life, I lived in Japan. And then right when I was done with middle school, junior high, is the first time that I moved to the States.
I
And
see.
so my first time going to the US was when I was 14.
Hmm.
And then, so, I went to middle school, high school in New York. And while I was there, most high schools in America have an internship program
Hmm.
right before you graduate. And so they basically want you to find some sort of a company or someone to work under
Mm-hmm.
for 2, 3 months before you graduate. So what had happened was right at that time, um, one of the guys in my class introduced me to a guy named Phil Ramone, who I had no idea who that was. Um, but me being a music lover and I used to play all sorts of instruments, but never really on the recording side.
Mm-hmm.
I looked up this guy and I was like, hmm, okay, you have a bunch of Grammys. Wow, these statues look really cool. Maybe I want one of these one day. Um, and I saw all the plaques that he has on the silver, platinum plaques and gold plaques he has on his wall. So it just looked really cool. And so I decided to take this internship with Phil Ramone, and that basically just changed my life. Um, I worked with him for 3 months at first, and then he wanted me to stay with him for another 6 months or 8 months. So I was with him for close to a year, and he's the one that told me, he said, you need to go to a music school and study engineering.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, okay, what's that? And he was like, if one day you want to become a producer like me, go study engineering and become an engineer first. Because he's one of the first few people that were on the path of going from engineer to producer. Um, he had his own studio in New York, in the 60s. And then he became a producer. So that was his vision of becoming a producer. So after he told me that, I applied for Berkeley and got into Berkeley. That's the first time I became serious about music.
That was at
Um,
eight. Which age was
that
that?
was at age 16.
Mm-hmm.
And then so once I got accepted into Berkeley, he told me, okay, you have another few months before you get to Berkeley. Um, let's have you work at a studio so you know what a studio environment is like.
Mm-hmm.
And he introduced me to Tony Bennett. And Tony Bennett had a studio where I ended up, working for 2, 3 years while I was at Berkeley. But so I mean, just starting when I was 16 is when I kind of became serious into this whole engineering thing. And so I went to Berkeley after that until I was 20.
And I really I don't even know how old you are. When were you born? Which year?
I was born in 1983, so I'm 41 now.
Okay.
Um,
So
so
that
that
was
was
in
in
the
the,
late 90s, very late 90s, right?
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
exactly.
Mm-hmm.
That was in the late 90s, and then I moved to Boston to go to Berkeley. And then when I finished Berkeley, I called up Phil Ramona again and I said, you know what? I did it. I went through
Mm-hmm.
school. Now what do I do? And he was so nice, and he called up a studio in New York named The Hit Factory, which was one of the big studios back then.
Mm-hmm.
And he called them up for me, and he was like, my guy's gonna be coming to you guys, so hire him.
Mm-hmm.
And so within a couple weeks, I got a job at the Hit Factory. Um, this is when I was this is when I was 20.
Mm-hmm.
And so, they wanted me to move to New York, so I moved to New York. And the studio was on 54th Street on the west side. So I started working with them, and that's where I kind of started my whole career as an assistant engineer, or I should say a runner first,
Mm-hmm.
what you guys call the T-boy. Um, so I was a T-boy at the age of 20 in New York.
Mhm.
You know,
Hey,
and
let me let
slowly
me
from
let me already ask a few questions
yeah,
because
yeah.
so first of all, like so before you even got into this, as you just described, you already were a music lover. Is there a musical background in your family, or how did you get triggered, to love music?
I was never really that into music.
Hmm.
It was nobody in my family is a musician. Nobody's really into music that much. So I really wasn't exposed to music too much. But when I was in elementary school, so like around grade 1 to 5, all of my friends were music lovers.
Hmm.
And they were really into, there was a big scene in Japan that came from Europe, the Eurobeat scene.
Hmm.
And so J-pop in the middle, the end of the 80s was a lot of Eurobeat
Hmm.
with Japanese lyrics. And I thought that was kind of cool back then. It was very poppy. It was very, almost bubblegum pop, except the tracks were really cool.
Hmm.
Um, you know, very Swedish, because a lot of Swedish producers were making J-pop back then.
Hmm. Hmm.
So that's kind of that was the first time I kind of started getting into music.
I don't know if you're aware of this, but this album that you mixed for me last year, Sea of
Uh-huh.
Hopeless Angels, with
Uh-huh.
Stefano Castagna, he is one of those Eurobeat guys who is very
Oh,
successful in
no
Japan.
way.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean it all started there and then I started playing um trombone in the school band.
Hmm.
Um but I was classically trained at that time.
Did you pick it, the trombone? Do you remember
You know,
how that happened?
here in Japan, what they do is they give every student a mouthpiece for every instrument.
Hmm.
They want you to blow into the mouthpiece, and the teacher chooses which instrument you're allowed to choose.
Oh.
And I was able to choose between trombone and flute.
Hmm.
And for some reason, I thought flute was for girls. And so here I am. I decided to, play this big ass trombone, which later on I realized that maybe I would have had more fun playing the flute. Um, After playing trombone for about 10 years, I wasn't into it anymore.
Hmm.
Because I was playing bass trombone all the time. So I was always on the low end of everything. The spotlight was never on me, you know? Um, and so I was always very jealous of the saxophone players, that had the spotlight on them all the time, and the flute players and all the people that that always got the melodies.
I'm thinking like in more technical engineering terms about the trombone, where you have the overtone series like this, and you
Yeah.
kind of like you have the EQ and everything right there.
Yeah. But this was way before I knew what being an engineer was. So,
Hmm.
I didn't
Yeah,
know
yeah,
any of that.
yeah.
But so yeah, that was the very, very beginning of my my getting into music instruments and then I told my dad to buy a keyboard for me and I bought some drums and I don't know, I was just jamming
Hmm.
out at home every day. Um so yeah, that's where it all started.
So your first language is Japanese then?
Well, that's tough because at home we would be speaking English.
Mm-hmm.
And I went to international school, which is all English.
Mm-hmm.
So my first language is English, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I consider Japanese to be my second language.
Yeah.
And my parents speak to me in Hindi, which is the Indian language. So,
Mm-hmm.
my parents are 100% Indian, so I have Indian roots. So that's my third language.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So you speak Hindi as well? Like
I do, I do.
fluently?
I'm not that good at it, but
Mm-hmm.
most of my grandparents, people that are of that age range, above 50, 55, don't speak much English, so I communicate to them in Hindi always.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wow. And so Berkeley, how was Berkeley?
So Berkeley was interesting, since I was in the music and production uh engineering major, um, and my dad, because he's very Indian, wasn't really happy that I should be studying music.
Mm-hmm.
Um, he kind of forced me to get into the business program at Berkeley.
Mm-hmm.
Um, And so I figured, okay, why not? So I chose two majors. One of them was production and engineering, and one of them was business and management. So my dad was happy. He was very happy to pay for my college because I was studying business.
Mm-hmm.
Little did he know that it had anything to do with any real type of business. Um, so Berkeley was good. The music and production engineering is it's very hard to get into that major. There's a long interview process that goes on, and out of thousands of people, they choose like 30 people only.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but luckily, because Phil Ramon had called them for me, I didn't have an interview or anything. The head of the department called me in personally, and he was like, "All right, I just have one question for you. How the hell did you work for Phil Ramon? That's all I want to know." That's the only one question I had. Um, but Berkeley was cool. A lot of I wasn't really into jazz at that time, so it was a brand new type of scene for me because I was more into pop and R&B and hip hop up until then. So this was the first time that I got exposed to jazz, which to me, in very engineering terms, um, I look at jazz as a very third side, like a third eye perspective, because I really did listen to it when I was growing up.
Mm-hmm.
So that's when I started listening to a lot of jazz records and started, like critically listening to them, picking out, trying to find different tones of different musicians. And, you know, if there were 50 saxophone players, I tried to figure out what the difference was in between them by their tone and
Mm-hmm.
not by the music.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a very I was dissecting different types of music back then. Um, and that's kind of, I think, one of the reasons now I do a lot of jazz, but I don't look at it as jazz. It's like a big formula inside my head.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I like to think of everything. I like to like mathematically decide how things should sound when I'm
Mm-hmm.
doing jazz.
Mm-hmm.
Um, when I'm doing other types of music, it's always about music for me. But when I'm doing jazz, it's all a formula in my head.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Like what I find, I think that like really like two distinct kinds of listening. Like one kind of listening is the for the structure of the music in terms of pitches and rhythms, and so where sound doesn't play any role. Like I say, you
Yeah.
can, if you can know how to read music, you can read a score of a Bach piece and enjoy reading the score. You don't need to
Right.
hear anything, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
that's the one side of listening, right?
Hmm.
So, and the other side of listening, where you don't hear the pitches, let's say, you hear the
Yeah.
sound, but you
Yes.
totally hear the timbre. You hold the and that's what it kind of like sounded like to me when you were describing how you deal with jazz,
A hundred
right?
percent, because when I hear sound out of the speakers, to me, it's all just a different, um, it's like a painting of different colors. And so for me, I don't hear pitch or rhythm or anything, and it's all just a big painting to me.
Yeah,
Yeah, just a lot of organized noise.
that's amazing. And
Yeah.
do you remember how, I guess, like working with Phil when you were so young, um, what did he kind of like pass on to you at that young age before you even became an engineer?
It's so hard to tell because at that time of life,
Hmm.
you don't realize how important of a time that was.
Hmm.
And me being just a young high school kid, um, I didn't think of it as a very important thing back then,
Hmm.
which I'm just so sad because I wish I could have soaked up a lot more information from him.
Hmm.
Um, but the only one thing that he would always tell me is he would always say, you have the perfect bedside manners to succeed in the music industry. And I never really understood what that meant. But 30 years later, 25 years later, now I finally understand, um, you know, what he was trying to tell me is it's all about communication, nothing else.
Hmm.
Um, and he would always talk to me about my manners and how I conduct myself.
Hmm.
Um, which he would say that it's not a learned trait. It's something that you're born with.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, it wasn't even anything technical that I got out of him.
Hmm.
But just just reassurance that, being a good person and, being with the right people, interacting with the right people, keeping the right people around you that
Hmm.
you're working with. Um, he was always into that. He was always very particular about who he works with, um, what kind of management he had, what kind of engineers he would hire, um, what kind of artists he would accept work from, um, which at that time was just so natural.
It's incredible, like the vote of confidence he gave you there, right? I think
Yeah,
he probably never questioned your that you can acquire the skills or that you
yeah,
can do whatever you want to do, but saying that you have the right vibe to be
yeah,
there. It's amazing. I mean, I know what you mean. At the time,
yeah,
probably didn't realize.
right.
Uh, yeah, but that what an honor to be, to get that sort of
Yeah,
knowledge passed on.
you know, and it was so sad because I didn't appreciate it at that time.
Well, yeah,
Um,
but how could you? But how could you?
yeah, yeah. I wish I. Had known better. But I'm so glad I went through it and every time I decide to do something, take a take a big step in life, like moving countries or building my own studio, I always think of him,
Mm-hmm.
and it's he's always in the back of my mind. I feel like
Mm-hmm.
he's just watching me, as I do it, everything. Yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that is, I mean, that is sort of how should I say? This is not the usual story, right?
Right. Right.
So the hit factory then. So you say you really started out as like making tea and recalling mixes and stuff like that. Uh, or
Yeah, we would be setting up sessions for all the artists and all the engineers that we had.
mm,
Um, our main job was how well we could display the fruit in the lobby for the artists.
mhm,
That's how all of us assistants would kind of get ranked,
mhm,
like the unwritten rule of who has the best manners in the sense of putting a display on and keeping the clients happy.
mhm,
Um, so I was doing that for a couple months, and the manager of the studio, um, she calls me up one day, second month in my job, and she says, "Are you ready?"
mhm.
And I said, "For what?" And she said, "We have a client, um, this reggae artist, this famous reggae artist named Elephant Man, who was big in the 80s, maybe the 90s. He was big in the 90s. And she said, so we have an artist coming in. They're going to be using the room that has a digital console in it. Most of our studios had analog consoles in it, except for one. And she said, so they're going to be in this room. Can I put you on the session? It's for 2 months. And I had no idea how to use the board.
Mhm.
But I figured, all right, I went to Berkeley. I think I studied. I think I'll figure it out if I have a couple hours. So I said, okay, yeah, sure. Let's do it.
Mhm, mhm.
So from that day on, she promoted me from a runner to an assistant. And she put me on a session for 2 months with Elephant Man, and we were just recording vocals for 2 months. The engineer who was on the session just kept telling the manager, how good I was and how helpful I was and just on top of everyone. And Elephant Man had a big team with him of like 10, 15 people. And every day I would take care of all 15 of them and make sure that everybody was happy and all that stuff. And so after 2 months finishing that session, the manager called me in again, and she said, "Are you ready?" And I said, "Now what?" And she's like, "That's it." She's like, "I think you're ready." I'm like, "All right, I'll do whatever you want me to do. I mean, I'm not sure what to do, but I'll do it."
Mhm,
So from then on, she would give me engineering jobs and assistant jobs and um a lot of the big mixers that would come in, um, the big guys like Dave Pensado, Tony Maserati, who were the big New York mixers back then. And she would want me to be on the sessions with them. And that's kind of where I really started learning about engineering and picking up my skills of engineering. So this was when I was about 21, maybe 21, 22.
mhm,
Um, but then what happened was in about a year, the studio closed.
mhm,
Um, this was in 2004 or five, right after Lehman shock. And so the economy of the States had just kept going down. And the owner of the building, of the studio, decided to sell the building
Hmm.
to a big real estate firm. And so, they called us in one day and they said, "All right, guys, that's it. You're all fired."
Wow.
And as of tomorrow, the Hit Factory is no longer. And so that was the last day of my work with them. Um, but in a way, I was happy because I felt like I was being challenged. I didn't have enough experience, but I feel like it was my, it was time for me to just become a freelance engineer and just try it out. Even though I was only 20, 22 at the time. Um, yeah,
Yeah, I saw that on Discogs. That's like when your credits start, right?
right,
2004,
right.
2005,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Hey, so let me, I'm curious about this. So when you started working, or you actually getting into assisting um, Pensado, for example, right? And you said that that was when you really started to learn about it.
Hmm.
Can you pinpoint what it was like to really learn about it? Like, what is the difference between what you had acquired up to that point to the real world thing?
I think the biggest thing for me was up until then, I would only listen to music that was already crafted.
Uh-huh.
So sounds that were totally done. So
Hmm.
they were recorded, mixed, mastered, and released. Um, being able to be in the rooms with these big mixers where they would be listening to the kick drum for 2 minutes, EQing it and compressing it and making the kick sound like what it should sound for the record.
Hmm.
But it was never the sound of what I had known the kick to be sound like.
Hmm. Hmm.
So that's when I kind of started realizing that within a mix, within a final song, what certain instruments need to sound like, what type of frequency placement they need to be in, how much space they need to take up in the mix, um, what kind of levels that they're mixing at, in order to get a proper mix. Um, all of this in school, they would give us numbers, but we could never experience it.
I see. Hmm.
So this was the first time that I could just listen to, when they put the kick and bass up and they find the perfect correlation between these two instruments. And then there's a point of time where it just sounds perfect
Hmm.
without any of the other instruments in yet. And then whatever other instruments they would put in, the low end of the record would just never change. So that was
Hmm.
amazing to me.
Hmm.
Um,
And
so
at that point, it was also like, as you say, beyond the numbers, right? It was about
right.
the listening and the taste, let's say, and the experience.
Yep.
And probably, I don't know what you think about this, but something that I learned, like whenever I'm working with real masters of their craft, is they hardly ever really verbally communicate
Yes.
what they do because they can't, because
Yep.
it's sort of like beyond things that you can really put into
Yep.
language, and you
Yep.
just have to find a way to understand how they go from A to B. And yeah, you know.
Exactly. And so it was hard because hard in a sense that all these guys, Pensado and them that were right in front of me, it was hard for me to ask questions because I
Hmm.
couldn't verbalize my questions.
Hmm.
But just listening to them work, I think was the biggest I don't know what to call it, like an academic teaching and
Yeah.
feeling that I got
Hmm.
from them.
Hmm.
Um, and so I was, I would be on a lot of mix sessions, and then once in a while, I would be assisting some engineers while they're recording, and that would be a whole different world because the kick drum sounded totally different than when Tony Maserati was mixing.
Hmm.
So that was a whole new school of thought for me. Um, but that really started making me think about, how to record in, you know, as natural of a way as possible, regardless of what type of a sound that you're going for. Um, Even if, let's say, you want something to be compressed and distorted, it should be as clean of a compressed sound as possible. It should be
Hmm.
as clean of a distorted sound as possible.
Hmm.
Um, so that took me about 10 years to figure out what was going
Hmm.
on. Um,
So while you were at Hit Factory, you had nothing to do with recording, right?
Very few sessions, very,
Mm.
very few.
Hmm.
Um, they would call me to engineer some vocal sessions because all of us young guys, the only chance we would get is to record vocals.
I see. Hmm.
Whenever anybody was recording a band, always the big name guys would come first.
Hmm.
Um, and then so once I left the Hit Factory, um, there was a studio in Las Vegas who the woman that was in charge of the Hit Factory, she moved to Las Vegas. And she called me up and she said, "Do you want to move to Vegas? This is one of the biggest entertainments in the States, as a city. So there's a lot
Hmm.
of interesting work out here." So I said yes, and I moved to Vegas, and that's when I really started engineering a lot. Because in Vegas there aren't too many engineers that live there.
Hmm.
But a lot of artists come through to perform shows, um, kind of like how I met you.
Hmm.
So a lot of the artists that would come to Vegas to perform shows would have some days off and they would want to record.
Hmm.
But they would never bring their engineers on the road with them, so they would always be willing to use us.
Hmm.
So that's where I started working with a lot of rock artists and a lot of pop, Celine Dion and Prince and Michael Jackson and Elton John, all these guys that had shows in Vegas. They would come by the studio on their days off just to record, a couple days here and there.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, that's when I was about 24, maybe 24, 25. Yeah,
Incredible. Yeah. So
yeah.
almost around 2010 then.
Yes, yes. Because
Incredible.
in 2009, I moved to Japan.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um,
I,
right
I
after I
actually,
had,
on this, it's funny, like in your discography, you can see exactly from 2009, you had just Japanese artists
right,
almost.
right. Yeah. Um, so in 2009, I kind of decided, I wanted to change, um, and I wanted to work with different artists and more younger artists,
Hmm.
instead of all the big guys. And at that point, I didn't want to move back to New York because I had already been there.
Hmm.
Um, so I always enjoyed going to a new place to get new inspiration and work with new artists and um so that's when I decided, you know what, maybe Tokyo seems like an interesting place where there's a lot of music. Um, there was a lot of artists back in 2009 that spoke English and Japanese, and all of their songs were half English, half Japanese. So I thought, okay, maybe I have a chance there. maybe they need someone bilingual and this might help them.
Hmm.
So in 2009, I just moved here and I didn't know anybody here. I didn't have any connections, nothing. But after moving here, the word got around that there's a bilingual guy in town,
Hmm.
um, who has a pretty crazy discography. You know, he's worked with Timbaland and Michael and Celine and Mariah and all these guys, but he's in Japan for some reason.
Hmm.
Um, and so a lot of the Japanese clients wanted to test me out. You know, it was a test back then.
Hmm.
Um, and so a lot of the Japanese R&B singers back then were bilingual. So, you know, I would help them with their English pronunciation and vocal directing. And in Japan, most of the engineers don't vocal direct.
Hmm.
They don't do vocal direction. So I was kind of like this new guy that um they were like, "Oh, we don't need to pay for a vocal director. Like you do it all. You
Hmm.
record it, you do the direction, you do the editing, like everything." I'm like, "Yeah, I'll do it all." Um, so that's what brought me to Japan in 2009.
And it was you were very sought after because of your skill set. Amazing.
Yeah.
That,
Yeah.
that's so you that's how you sort of like started building a like when did you start having your own studio?
So after working here for about 5, 6 years,
Hmm.
um, from 2009 to about 2012, 2013, I was roaming around all the studios every day. I had
Hmm.
this company that would be moving all my gear for me every day. Um, you know, I was spending so much money on transportation of my gear.
Hmm.
You know, it was almost 2,000, $2,500 a month just to move my gear around. Um, so that's when I started deciding, okay, if my clients are willing to pay me this much money
Hmm.
to go to these huge studios just to record one vocal in the middle of like this huge ass room,
Hmm.
why can't I build a studio, charge 30% cheaper of these studios, and then everybody will want to come to me
Hmm.
because I'll be the cheapest guy in town. And I was 29 years old at the time. And
Hmm.
I decided that's when I decided, you know what? I think my next dream is the time that I'm 30 years old. I want to have my own studio. So I only had 1 year.
Hmm.
So I started planning and building a studio costs a lot of money. So I started talking to all the banks and trying to figure out all the funding for the studio. But when I was 30, um, I opened up my first studio.
But that's not the location that I know, right?
That
The
is the
location that
location
I
that
know.
you know.
Oh, really? Amazing.
That is the location, but it was a different studio.
Hmm.
Because 5 years into the studio, I actually had a big water damage
Hmm.
inside that studio, and it kind of flushed out the whole studio. And and so what I had to do is I broke the whole studio down once, and I built it up again with a different design. So when you came to the studio, is after I put the Fazioli piano inside, which was the second time around.
Okay.
Yeah. Because originally I had a Yamaha piano in my studio, but I was recording a lot of jazz pianists I make a lot of records for pianists. And so when I broke my studio down, I was like, you know what? It's gonna cost me a lot of money, but I think I want a Steinway and a Fazioli in my studio. I was crazy, you know.
Yeah.
But I did it, and that's where I met you.
Yeah, it's a wonderful place. What I like about studios is that they're almost like a city within a city. Like,
Uh-huh.
if you know what I mean, like you come into this space which is really so like, especially because it's also underground,
Right.
right? Like, so
Yeah.
you go downstairs and then there's this um but yeah, I mean this I, what I find fascinating, right, is
Uh-huh.
just even the example of the Fazioli, right? So like, I mean, in a way it's obvious, but like, why does Neeraj know of that sound? Like, why, like, so there must, what you must be doing is you must be always processing, hearing, like connecting, like understanding, sort of like which, that's also because you're also I hope I can say that, like, you're a nerd when it comes to gear,
Yeah,
right?
of course.
But it's interesting because I'm not a nerd when it comes to gear at all. Like, you can give me
Yeah.
anything and I can do something with it, right? So for
Right.
me, but like, just building this whole sort of understanding and love for everything that's included in the process, and that, including the toys. Um,
Always, always. That's one of the things that's always been very fascinating to me is
mhm,
why certain musicians use certain instruments. Um, so I always like to research about, any instrument.
mhm, mhm,
Um, I feel like that helps with my communication with the musician, and the musician then will feel more comfortable um, talking about some sort of a direction sound-wise that we're
mhm.
aiming for. I always feel like, um, for you to get a good drum sound, you need to be more knowledgeable about the drums than the drummer to get the best
Yes.
sound.
Mhm.
I'm not saying that I know more, but I try to. Um, and this is the thing, when I met you for the first time, why I got so excited is because in a normal pop scene, you never get to really record like 12-string guitars, 16-string guitars. It's so rare, but I was a geek and a nerd, and I knew the war guitar, and I knew the touch guitar, and I knew, the stick.
Mhm.
And I was just like, wait, what is this instrument that you have? I kind of know what this is. Um, and so, yeah, that it just gets me excited. I just love that
It's
stuff.
I think this is sort of like also what Phil Ramone probably meant, is like the to be genuinely interested in people
Right,
and in the world, right?
right,
And if he saw that spark in you, then he was sure that you would do
right,
it.
right, right.
Yeah, I mean, the funny thing is, like, I didn't really play the touch guitar like a touch guitar when we were recording
I know.
this.
Uh,
Yeah. So,
but that was
yeah.
such a great that was such a I had been in Japan for 6, 7 years before I met you guys, and I was starting to become very static with the way I was working, always
Hmm.
working with the same musicians with the same type of music. And here you guys came to the studio, and you're like, we have nothing planned. We're just gonna, experiment.
Hmm.
And I'm just like, whoa, wait a second. All right, now, so that's how you guys got the juices flowing inside my system, you know?
Mhm.
It's like, okay, wow, now this is what I call creative, you know?
And like the first piece on the record, like the pieces are on the record the way that way in the
Yeah,
same sequence that they were
yeah,
recorded. And the very
yeah.
first one, that's the sound check. That's a
Right.
loop I record during the sound check with you walking through the room. Like you can hear
Yeah.
your feet. Yeah, yeah,
Oh,
yeah. It's such a, like, and I'm very curious, like to go back to the question of gear, right?
uh-huh.
So how would I mean I know that your hearing is very um, like finely tuned in a way, right? But what is sort of like the when you compare two pieces of gear, let's say two compressors, okay?
Mhm.
Are you analytical in the sense of like what you say when you record jazz, or are you like more about the musicality or let's say the emotion of the piece of equipment?
I
Or is it
think
both?
what I think what it is in my mind, all I'm comparing is the amount of saturation that's in the
Hmm.
sound.
Hmm.
And I feel like saturation has a direct connection with human emotion because most people don't know it, but when you listen to a recording that's been recorded in, let's say, the 50s had a sound of saturation that they could only create in the 50s.
Hmm.
And then there was saturation in the 60s and then the 70s, and it was all different. So I feel like we have, as human beings, we have this connection to saturation, which leaves footprints in our mind and our heart of what we're hearing. And I feel like when I'm testing out two pieces of gear or even two pieces of instruments,
Hmm.
if I have two snares that I'm testing out, I listen to what kind of saturation it gives out. Um, and I feel like it's technical in a way, but on the other side, it's actually not very technical because
Hmm.
it's a feeling.
Yes.
And
I mean,
it reminds me of a time of period or a sound from a time of period.
hmm.
Where let's say if I use a compressor and I compress something, 20 seconds of listening to that compressor in my mind, the first thing I think about is, oh, okay, this compressor sounds like this piece of gear from the 90s or from 1985, this piece of gear. So if I'm aiming for that sound, then I know I should use it.
Hmm.
So by listening to all these different types of saturations, they get placed inside my brain into this big closet that has a million drawers, and each drawer has a different type of saturation in it. And so when I'm recording a new band or a new instrument for the first time, and I listen to the song and I listen to what kind of an arrangement you guys have, um, usually within the first, 30 seconds, by listening to the arrangement, I have an idea of what the arranger has in mind, of how they want certain different frequency wise, how they want things to be placed out in a piece of music.
Hmm.
Um, so that's when I start opening up the drawers in my brain and trying to figure out, oh, okay, you know what? I need to put this preamp on this piano.
Hmm.
I need to put this mic on this piano, or I need to put this compression on this piano to get the sound, to place the piano in a space that the arranger is going for. Um, not just where I want it to be, but more of where the music wants it to be.
Oh,
I think there's a
that's perfect.
yeah.
I mean, like a lot of engineers, well, not really, I wouldn't say like real mix engineers, but a lot of talk about mixing is about separation, like where people talk about
Yeah.
separation. But it's I think it's the opposite, like what you say, like the texture, like
Yes.
the saturation that the texture makes two sounds actually connect. So, and
Yes.
if you don't have those textures, it just won't work. It won't gel. So you can try to separate things as much as you want. It's never going to work as a piece, right?
Oh, that's exactly true. That's exactly what I'm always thinking about.
I mean, I mean,
Especially,
I call it integration rather than
oh,
separation.
okay. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, oh man, that's so true because whenever I do seminars and I try to, this is such a hard thing to explain, but I try to explain to a lot of my students, um, when you listen to music, there's always an underlying bed of noise
Hmm.
that's connecting different music, different elements of the mix.
Hmm.
And when it's too clean, it's white.
Hmm.
But you don't want it to be white because that's not music.
Hmm.
That's just clinically made sound.
Hmm.
And so you want to try to get the spaces between the instruments be black. That's what you're aiming for. And that's exactly what you're saying is to the
Hmm.
interaction, the connection. That's
Yes.
exactly what I'm always aiming for.
Hmm. And
Yeah.
then that's also what you kind of like see in the pieces of equipment, like what kind of glue or what kind of
Yep.
saturation, what kind of
Yep.
texture, what kind of interaction can it create?
Exactly. Exactly. Because I'm actually not a very specific guy in the sense of, you know, EQing things like, turn up zero point 0.3 dB of
Mm,
75 hertz to make the bass sound good. Like I just don't know any of that stuff. It
mm,
doesn't resonate to me.
mm,
Um, but yeah, so I guess in a sense it's just the feeling.
mm,
Yeah.
mm. Yeah, and like feeling exactly. Like we could say use the word emotion, right?
Yes, yes,
And
yes.
that's something that I have experienced with great musicians and great mix engineers as well, is like somebody, as you were saying, like works on the kick for a few minutes and brings the bass in, and then suddenly like you listen and you have an impact that's emotional rather than just
Yeah.
sonic,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, like with the first time I met and visited Pat Mastelotto at his studio was
Uh-huh.
incredible. He like the very first thing he played for me in the room was like one hit on a tom tom, on a big tom tom. Like, and it was like poof, and I had like goosebumps all over my body just from that, the way that he made that drum sound.
Yeah.
uh, and that's really what it is about in the end, right? The emotion. I mean,
Yeah.
I still don't believe that you can really control that. You know, you can't really control what people will feel, but you can find sort of like an some sort of average that like
Yeah.
hits a lot of people. And if
Yeah.
you have that kind of taste, then you're going to be successful,
Right,
right?
right. Yeah.
So what does your father, is your father still with you? Yeah, for sure. I hope.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So what does he think about your career now?
So until I was 25, he was always against it.
Hmm.
Um, but when I turned 30 and I built my studio for the first time
Hmm.
in Tokyo, I invited
Hmm.
him. I told him to come to Japan. He
Hmm.
walked into the studio, and I think that's the first time that
Hmm.
he felt like his son has is successful.
Yes.
Yeah.
So So are your parents in the US or where are they?
They live in India now.
They live in India. Oh,
Yeah. Um, but yeah, that was the first time that I felt like I got the okay sign from him.
oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Like for me, it was creating the touch guitar. That was the thing.
Hmm.
Because before that, all I was doing was sort of like had some idealistic value rather than physical object. And then once I had the
Right.
guitar, and I remember I brought like guitars home from, I built them in Austin, and I flew them via Houston to Frankfurt, and I put them on the sofa at my parents' place, you
Yeah.
know, so that here, look at this. This is what I'm doing. This is what.
That's amazing.
So tell me a little bit about you're one of the um, people who got into Atmos like in the past, like was it 5 years or so?
Yeah.
Um, Tell me a little bit about that. Like, what was your way into mixing in Dolby Atmos?
So a lot of my friends in America, a lot of the engineers started changing their home studios to Atmos ready
Hmm.
rooms, which was very shocking to me because when 5.1 became popular at one time, nobody did that. No, none of the engineers changed their studios for 5.1.
Hmm.
And so when everyone started changing their studios for Atmos, this was about maybe 5 years ago. I started feeling like, okay, maybe there's some change gonna happen. There are too many engineers spending too much money to try to be able to mix in Atmos. And so that's when I started thinking about it. And about 3 years ago, I decided that, okay, maybe this is an investment that I should venture
Hmm.
and try out because it might show me a new perspective of what music can be.
Hmm.
The um what do you call it? Like kind of like what the future, maybe it's one thing in the future that the music, the direction it's gonna take. Maybe this is an important time of music. And
Hmm.
so what happened was I built a studio. Um, and the thing about Amos is you have to spend so much money to build a studio. It's really hard to do just um, as a hobby or just, you can't really half-ass it. It's got to
Hmm.
be, you know, if you want to do it right, then you got to spend 100, $200,000 to build a proper place. Um, so I pulled the trigger and I did it. So about 2 years ago, I built the room. And slowly Japan started trying it out.
Hmm.
Now in the States, everybody's doing it because all the major labels, they want you to submit a mix, not just in stereo, but in Atmos too. So they want two mixes for every song.
Hmm.
So I felt like, okay, maybe one day in Japan, this might be the same. Hopefully, if things catch on, then I think it'll be good that I have my own place instead of trying to rent a room just to mix Atmos.
Hmm.
And so slowly it started, people were afraid of it at the beginning, both on the financial side of things and the practical side of things. Um, we could mix an album in Atmos, but who's actually gonna be
Hmm.
able to listen, in an atmosphere? Um, but slowly it started getting a little bit more popular and people are doing it now here. It's still pretty, it's still not very, it's not the majority of the scene here. Maybe like 10% of the
Hmm.
scene. Um, and so I started mixing it. I started, but it's like a whole new way of mixing. And so it took me about 6 months to really be able to mix in Atmos properly. Um, and I felt like I was relearning how to mix,
Hmm.
except I had no teacher this time.
Hmm.
Back at the Hit Factory, I had a bunch of teachers that I could watch and learn. And now here I am where all of my assistants are looking at me, hoping I'd teach, hoping that they can learn how to mix an Atmos from me when I've never done it before.
Hmm.
So it took me a couple months to really, just dissect and critically listen to a lot of different Atmos mixes and try to figure out what's good and what's bad. Um, Not just on speakers, but on earphones and on sound bars, and on Apple Music through regular speakers on the computer. Just trying to listen on various different platforms and trying to figure out what's the best way to mix music that people can relate to.
Hmm.
Because I always feel like the listener doesn't really need to know that it's Atmos, but I feel like they just should be able to have a connection with the music, and hopefully a deeper connection than stereo. But that's just a hope. That's a wishful thinking inside my part. Um, so after a while, all the businesses here and all the record labels were always worried about, but who's going to be able to listen to these Atmos mixes? And I would always tell them that it doesn't matter.
Hmm.
It's a format that can morph itself to any device.
Hmm.
So you don't need to think about who's going to be able to listen to it or why they listen to it. But we're on the side of the table where we need to provide this to everybody. Um, and so, I got a bunch of companies that were record label guys that were interested in it. And so in 2023, in a year, I mixed about 400 songs in Atmos. Um, about maybe 20 or 30 of them were with you. Um,
Yes.
and then a bunch of rock stuff and it's a lot of pop stuff and all sorts of genres, I tried to do a little bit of. Um, so yeah, it's been about a year and a half since I've been doing it. Um, it's still not as accessible to everybody and easy for everyone to, mix in Atmos still, I feel like. Um, just because of the costs that come with, mixing in
Yeah,
Atmos.
sure.
But who knows
Um,
if it's gonna become even more popular than now, I'm not sure. But the way it seems like Apple and Universal and Adobe is just putting a lot of time and effort into trying to really get this Atmos, as a standard.
yeah, I mean, Apple has made it the default, right,
Yeah.
for their products. You know what I find most fascinating about this? First of all, like your openness to embrace a new format. And as you
Hmm.
say, once I understood that it is scalable and scales itself, right? I
Yeah,
think that's an amazing thing. That's something that
yeah,
that should like already like when people start. I mean, we didn't have the technology, but maybe people were already thinking, okay, maybe we can record something in such a way that it can just be scaled to any
right.
degree of like size.
Yeah.
But and this is sort of like I want to ask you this, like you as an engineer, the paradigm in stereo mixing, where we're talking about saturation, and interaction. This has been completely questioned in a way with the Dolby Atmos mixing. So people who have been in the business, like where everything is about creating that interaction with some, bus compression or any kind of like subgroup mixing and stuff like that. All of that has become like, and the question is like, how do you recreate? Because like if you want, unfortunately, we have to think in recreating an older sound within the new format, and
Yes.
I think that must be extremely challenging, right?
It's very difficult because on a stereo recording, the amount of saturation that, let's say, you think is the perfect amount of saturation, once it becomes Atmos, you're basically multiplying that by 14, 13.
Mm-hmm.
And so you need 13 as more amount of saturation, 13 times more in
Mm-hmm.
order to get the same amount of impact.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Um, and so this is the balance that I'm always fighting with is um, if I did 13 times of saturation, everything would sound like it's from the 40s, which is not good
Mm-hmm.
most of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I had to find a balance of how much more saturation or how to trick the ear actually to think that there's as much saturation as in stereo. So I found a lot of different ways of doing things I would never do in stereo, which is actually not saturation. But there are different types of limiting that I use that mimic the saturation.
I see.
And so that's how I have been able to kind of get the correlation between stereo and Atmos. Yeah.
Wow. Wow. So, but the limiting would still be discrete, right? On discrete channels, or is there a secret you don't want to share?
No, I'm open to everything, but no, it's not discrete.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Because
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
kind of like earlier, what I was talking about in between the instruments, the black noise that I'm trying to add in the music,
Yeah.
what I try to do in Atmos is I try to find different pairs of space. So they're not channels, but I do zoning. I do a zoning system where I find spaces and I add saturation and noise to different spaces within the Atmos field.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so once it gets down mixed into a stereo mix, it sounds exactly like the stereo.
Mm-hmm.
But when you space it out, the thing is when I listen to a lot of different people's Atmos mixes, they sound very clean, which I think is a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what everybody's aiming for. But I just feel like it's too clean.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so when I mix, I don't want to make it that crystal clear. Um, I want, of course, I want things to be bright and clear, but on the other side of that, I want there to be as much uh pleasing noise as there is clear sounds.
it's when I first heard 5.1 mixes. When was
Hmm.
that? Or early 2000s or 2005, that
Hmm.
I was always shocked about, like, yes, as you say, like the white space that was in between, like blank white space.
Yeah.
Horrible. I didn't really enjoy it much. And there was one album that changed my mind, which was I don't know if you know this. It was a Depeche Mode record, "Sounds of the Universe" it was called.
Oh, yes, of course.
You know that record? And that was the
Yeah.
first one that when I heard it in 5.1, I said, "Oh my, they made it work." And I never thought about it much, but now that you say it, I think it's the amount of distortion and interaction between the channels that somehow I remember I was walking around in my room. I was even walking around outside of the speakers, right?
Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
still worked. And yeah, and now I understand why.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean,
We
and
we all, it's so funny because I have my own theories and my own ways of doing this.
mhm.
But the problem is it's such a new format that nobody knows if this is right. If this is the right way to do it, which is not a big deal, for me. Because I feel like we need to keep evolving music and the way that we make music. So it's totally fine. But
But you know how it goes though, right? Like the what is the right way is usually the way that people know.
yeah,
So with music, like I was always wondering, like why do we have a certain microphone, let's say, and people say this microphone sounds great? Because
yeah,
obviously, as you say, it has a certain level of saturation, distortion. It kind of it can't ever be the real sound. Okay,
yes,
so why do we say it sounds great? It's because we have listened, we've heard this microphone in action so many times.
yeah,
And I'm not trying to
exactly.
say that it doesn't objectively sound good. I think there may be some reasons why we could say that, but it's
Hmm.
very much about like a lot of people hearing the same thing and then deciding, okay, this is the right
Yeah,
way.
yeah,
And I think
that's
the same is going to happen with the Atmos mixing at some point.
yeah, yeah. Because I mean, at now in 2024, we're what, at the end of 2024 now. Um,
Well, in the
Atmos
middle.
is, well, getting close to the end of in a couple months. Um, but now, so Atmos Mixes has been around for 10, almost 10 years now.
Mhm,
A couple years ago when I was building my studio, it had been about 7 years. So we're about at 10 years now, which I think is it's a good chunk of time
mhm,
and a good amount of, at some point in the future, people will be looking back to this time of Atmos mixing and will consider this as one era of music,
mhm.
um, which should be interesting 30, 40 years from now. So I'm excited to see, 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, how music, not just in Atmos, but just music in general is gonna evolve. Um, it should be interesting.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And I mean, like at some point, I'd like to come to an end, but I want to ask you one more thing about um, pop music, right?
Hmm.
So how do you see? I think within the last, let's say, like in the last 35 years, in the 90s, early 90s, things started changing so drastically about production, right?
Hmm.
And maybe just like from my perspective, and that's why I'm asking, from my perspective, around 2005 or something, that was sort of like when like a new gold standard, was there. And
Yeah.
now how have things changed in the last 20 years? Like basically the time that you've been out there doing work. in pop music? What is happening? What is like sonically? How do people get these sounds? Because everything, like I mean, I don't want to say everything, but a lot sounds really, really great, right? There's a
Hmm.
lot of music out there that's sort of like pristine in a
Yeah.
very unique way,
Yeah.
where you can see that all the knowledge of like say always 100 years of recording music sort of comes
Yeah.
together into this pristine product. um, what do you see as a development? Like how would you describe what's happening?
I feel like the thing that changed everything is when people started using a lot more software-based instruments. I think that
Hmm.
was the start of when sonically pop records started changing.
Hmm.
Because up to about 25, 30 years ago, it was more about really keeping everything live and not playing to a click, um, keeping things more open and free and uh, unorganized in a good way.
Hmm.
And then I I feel like when technology started becoming more digital, in the maybe mid 90s, late 90s, in the 2000s, people were able to create a lot more real sounding records synthetically. So at the beginning of this pop phase, I feel like things weren't sounding very good because everybody was still trying to mimic it.
Hmm. Hmm.
Uh, we were, I feel like we were trying to make it sound real.
Hmm.
Um, and then technology advancements were so fast in time that most of the synthetic instruments started sounding so real or close enough to use in this pop sound sonically. It's 80% of the time it's easier to make it sound sonically better using a synthetic sound compared to a real sound. Um, and um I feel like distortion is a big part of it. So like saturation and distortion, kind of the topic that we've been talking about a lot today.
Yeah.
Um, at the beginning of digital, everything was just too clean. We weren't getting used to it. And I feel like now we listen to records and it sounds like a real guitar or like a real drum,
Hmm.
but it's all fake. But that's because the people that are recording these samples or the way that we're mixing records now, there's so many ways that we can trick things. We can trick the human ear for it to sound a certain way, and we can really pinpoint exactly the time frame of what we want a drum to sound like. We want the drums to sound, like a Zeppelin record from the 70s or
Hmm.
a record from the 2000s or whatever. And so I feel like there was a period of time when everything became so synthetic and so on the grid. People started getting sick of it in a way.
Hmm.
And so now, in the past 15 years, I feel like it's the perfect balance between keeping things proper and keeping things, uh, I don't want to say old school, but old school in a way,
Yeah, loose, right?
loose.
Yeah.
So I feel like we're in a good place right now where most of the American pop music, is it's the rhythm is always tight, but the things on top of it is more loose and groovy and it just feels good and
Hmm.
that kind of helps the vocalists kind of do their own thing. They can be in
Hmm.
their own space.
Hmm.
I think that's how it evolved into the current pop sound.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And also again, like the as you say, the saturation again, it's really, and now like looking back at my original question to you, what I mean about things sounding so great these days is that there are just so many people out there these days who know how to take advantage of the saturation, how to
Yes,
make
yes,
that work,
yes.
right?
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, exactly.
And you know what? I have this is like mostly an intuitive thing that I'm going to say now, but now for me somehow that's starting to get boring because
Yeah,
sometimes what I find is that if things are too too well, if it's like very well done, somehow things sometimes then they deflate. They
yes,
get feel
yes,
smaller. Like you have a really great mix, and
yeah,
then you compare it to some like a rougher mix of something. The rough
yeah,
mix is like huge,
yeah,
and the great mix feels small against it. And I'm
yeah.
and anyway, I mean, I just like this and where is it gonna go? You have any idea? Where are things gonna go?
I feel like because of the way social networking and all these streaming platforms are kind of taking over now,
Mhm.
regardless of, most of the industry being very against it. But even though people are against it, the last couple of years have been worldwide the most amount of music sales in the history of music.
Mhm.
Um, which is amazing because on one side, people are complaining about how cheap streaming payouts are,
Mhm.
but this is the most money that we've ever made as an industry.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean
Um,
that I guess that's more about where the money goes rather
right,
than how much there is. But I
right.
but I'm with you.
Yes. Um, so what I was trying to
Mhm.
get to is that because of the way that we're creating music now, I feel like it's gonna get more localized. So certain parts of the world will have more localized, stronger like music circles and groups of people that will come together to provide music for a smaller space. Even though the internet is so open and to everybody, I feel like the past 20 years we've realized that it really doesn't work.
Mhm.
And so I feel like we're going to use this technology and use the platforms to be more focused and to target a more focused amount of people. And I feel like, musicians are going to start thinking about that more when they're creating.
You know what? I agree. I agree.
Yeah.
It's sort of like the law, even the logical thing.
Yeah.
It's kind of like once everything has been spread out so far, you need to kind of like brush it together and start
Yeah.
making your little pile, your little local
Yeah.
pile of stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I
Yeah.
totally agree.
Yeah.
Wow, man, it's a pleasure talking to you.
Likewise.
It's wonderful,
This is
and
great. I love it.
yeah, and I think I'm gonna have something for you soon, a little Atmos mix.
Yeah. I'm excited.
Okay, man, I gotta put my glasses on and start my day.
Nice. What time is it over there?
No, it's 11:30
Oh,
in the
good.
morning. So
Good, good.
yeah. No, I took my daughter to kindergarten this morning, and
Okay.
it was very stressful.
Oh, yeah. Thanks for doing this, man. I'm honored, that you would ask me. That's cool. I'm happy.
No, I love what you do, and as like Phil said, you have the vibe, and it's
Thanks,
so
man.
it's so it's so important to be friendly, to be open, to have a big heart. I think it's so important when you're working in the arts, especially
Yeah.
with music, especially music
Yeah.
is, and you know, music is so how to say, so precious,
Right.
actually. Like we should never forget about that. It's a
Yeah.
very precious thing, and that's why precious people, you know, make music happen. I
Make
really
music
think so.
happen. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's true. That's so true.
Okay.
Cool,
Thanks so much for
man.
now.